Comment on the video, where are people watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. In the quiet community of Willow Creek, Richard Malone had recently settled into his new home, anticipating a peaceful life after years of bustling city living. His delight, however, was short-lived. Within days of moving in, Richard began receiving a series of notices from the local Homeowners Association, HOA, a group he was unaware his home was subject to. The notices, each more petty and trivial than the last, claimed violations ranging from the length of his lawn grass to the incorrect disposal of recycling. The correspondence was marked with the authoritative insignia of the Willow Creek Community Association, each letter more demanding and severe. These so-called violations came with fines that started small but quickly escalated, threatening further action if not promptly resolved. Richard, puzzled and frustrated, scrutinized his property deeds and documents only to confirm what he initially believed: his property was not part of any HOA jurisdiction. The fines seemed particularly absurd given Richard's meticulous nature. His lawn was always immaculately trimmed, and his recycling bins were sorted with precision. It became evident that these were not legitimate grievances but rather fabricated charges aimed at harassing him. Each notice bore the name of the HOA president, Eleanor Voss, a name that quickly became synonymous with unwarranted authoritarianism in Richard's view. Richard's attempts to contact Eleanor and resolve these misunderstandings were futile. Calls went unanswered, and letters were returned unopened. The situation escalated when a final notice arrived, stating that if the fines were not paid, legal action would be pursued. The stress of these baseless accusations began to take its toll on Richard, casting a shadow over his new home's warm glow. One brisk morning, as Richard was tending to his garden, he was approached by Eleanor Voss herself. With an air of condescension, she handed him another notice of violation. This time, the alleged offense was even more ludicrous: unauthorized garden decor. Eleanor, with her clipboard clutched tightly, detailed the fines and repercussions with a tone that brooked no argument. Richard, having reached his limit, confronted Eleanor about the legitimacy of her claims. He pointed out the inconsistencies and the lack of jurisdiction her HOA had over his property. Eleanor, unfazed, insisted that his property was under their governance and that compliance was not optional. The heated exchange grew intense as Richard categorically rejected the false charges and Eleanor's authority over his home. Eleanor threatened further penalties and left with a promise that the matter would be escalated to legal channels. Richard, determined not to be bullied into submission, decided to investigate the legality of these charges and Eleanor's authority. His resolve solidified: he would not bend to the whims of a tyrannical HOA president who seemed to thrive on control and intimidation. The confrontation with Eleanor had ignited a fire within Richard. He began meticulously gathering all communications and notices from the HOA, documenting every false charge and unfounded claim. Armed with his evidence, Richard sought legal counsel to dispute the HOA's authority over his property. In his meeting with the lawyer, Richard laid out his case, presenting the detailed logs and correspondence that highlighted the absurdity and frequency of the fines. His lawyer, intrigued by the audacity of the HOA's claims, agreed that Richard's property was not part of the HOA and that Eleanor's actions were overreaching at best and potentially illegal at worst. Empowered by legal support, Richard drafted a formal letter to the HOA, denying their claims and demanding a cessation of all harassment. He cited the specific legal boundaries that Eleanor had crossed and warned of potential legal repercussions if the harassment did not stop immediately. As days passed, the atmosphere around Richard's home grew tense. He noticed unusual activities, like unfamiliar cars parked near his home at odd hours, and he suspected that Eleanor was not going to retreat quietly. Despite the unnerving developments, Richard remained steadfast, prepared to defend his rights and his home from the baseless tyranny of a fabricated HOA authority. In the days following his defiant correspondence with Eleanor Voss, Richard Malone's quiet life in Willow Creek was abruptly shattered by a series of disturbing events. One early morning, while Richard prepared his coffee and surveyed his cherished garden, once his sanctuary of calm, he discovered that the front yard had been deliberately vandalized. The once pristine flower beds were trampled, and decorative stones had been scattered with malicious disregard. His prized lavender bushes were defaced by crude graffiti, a scrawled warning that underscored the cruelty behind these acts. This devastation was not random, it was a targeted message of intimidation meant to unsettle him and, by extension, the community. Richard's heart pounded as he inspected the damage. The vandalism was artfully destructive, a clear statement from those aligned with Eleanor's twisted agenda. Rumors in the neighborhood soon began to circulate like wildfire. Whispers in hushed tones mentioned a fabricated warrant being issued against him for ignoring the impossible fines levied on his property. The notion of a warrant, however fabricated it might have been, was enough to induce fear. Neighbors, once respectful and cordial, now exchanged apprehensive glances every time Richard stepped outside, and the atmosphere was thick with dread. Unable to ignore the escalating threats, Richard took measures to secure his property. He installed security cameras along the perimeter and started documenting every unusual occurrence. It wasn't long before the cameras captured shadowy figures lurking around his garden in the dead of night, individuals concealed by hooded jackets whose deliberate action suggested careful planning. Although the faces were never fully seen, the timing and method of their trespasses strongly implicated that the harassment was orchestrated by forces connected to Eleanor Voss's rogue operations. The constant intimidation began to gnaw at the sense of safety that had once been intrinsic to Willow Creek. Richard could see that the vandalism and the ominous rumors were tools of control, intended to subdue any resistance from those who dared question the authority of the HOA under Eleanor's command. Even as the community began to whisper in fear, Richard resolved not to cower. Every act of vandalism further ignited his determination to expose the injustice that had infiltrated the neighborhood. Richard's investigations quickly revealed a disturbing pattern. The dates of the vandalism, the delivery of threatening letters, and the odd visits by unknown individuals all coincided with a timetable that Eleanor Voss had established for stepping up her oppressive measures. The messages, replete with ominous warnings and absurd citations, were designed to confuse and terrify not only him but also to discourage any public outcry from his neighbors. The meticulously orchestrated harassment was intended to create a climate in which fear silenced dissent. Feeling increasingly isolated, Richard reached out to a few trusted neighbors. Initially, many had been reluctant to get involved, their voices subdued by the ever-growing specter of retribution. But as Richard presented his documented evidence and shared the disturbing security footage, the cautious whispers transformed into determined murmurs. A small collective emerged, united by a shared determination to reclaim their community from the clutches of tyranny. This grassroots resistance slowly gathered momentum, as others recounted their own encounters with unfounded fines and unjustified property inspections initiated by Eleanor's operatives. The intimidation tactics were no longer isolated acts of vandalism, they had grown into a systematic campaign designed to paralyze community members through fear. Richard realized that the stability and peace of Willow Creek were under siege, and that the well-being of every resident was at stake. His resolve hardened, and he prepared himself for the looming confrontation. Now, not only was his own sense of security compromised, but the very spirit of the community was being eroded. That fateful morning, amid the echo of shattered tranquility and the chilling whispers of fabricated warrants, Richard Malone resolved to fight back. He recognized that these acts of vandalism and intimidation were the precursor to something far larger, a full-blown campaign of terror engineered by Eleanor Voss, whose unchecked ambition now posed a threat to every law-abiding member of Willow Creek. The tension in Willow Creek reached an explosive peak one bright autumn afternoon when Richard Malone was unexpectedly confronted by a scene that tested the limits of his patience and resolve. On that day, as he was reviewing his growing dossier of evidence regarding the harassment he had endured, two men appeared at his door, clad in uniforms resembling those of the HOA enforcement arm. Their expressions were stern and their demeanor cold, lending a semblance of official authority to their presence. However, what followed was as shocking as it was revealing. The doorbell rang sharply, and before Richard could even brace himself, the two men burst into the foyer with a sense of urgency that was both dramatic and foreboding. One of them thrust a piece of paper into his hand, a warrant, it claimed, for Richard's arrest. The document was adorned with the same insignia Richard had seen on previous notices and was accompanied by stern warnings about the consequences of defying the HOA's orders. In that disquieting moment, Richard's heart raced. He had heard rumors of such tactics, but nothing could have prepared him for the actual confrontation. As the two men began to recite a litany of fabricated violations, it became increasingly obvious that the entire procedure was nothing more than an elaborate ruse. With a calmness that belied the chaos of the moment, Richard slowly reached for his concealed identity badge, a symbol of his true position and authority. In a firm and resolute tone, he declared, "I am Richard Malone, a United States Marshal." The words reverberated through the room, stalling the would-be enforcers in mid-sentence. Shock and disbelief were etched across the faces of the impostors, who had expected submission rather than exposure. With his badge clearly visible, Richard recounted his documented evidence of harassment and abuse, detailing every instance of intimidation and fraudulent fines. The men, now visibly rattled, fumbled with the warrant as it became painfully clear that they had been duped. Eleanor Voss's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble as Richard's declaration appended her scheme in real time. The impostors, having acted on nothing more than fabricated orders and false authority, could only stammer incoherently before retreating. Their sudden retreat did not erase the danger that had just transpired, but it did serve as a public repudiation of the farce that Eleanor had been peddling to the community. In the aftermath, Richard took no chances. He immediately contacted local law enforcement to report the attempted wrongful arrest, ensuring that the incident was recorded as part of the larger investigation into Eleanor Voss's corrupt activities. His courageous act not only defused a dangerous situation but also emboldened his neighbors and fellow residents. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek, and the incident galvanized the community, demonstrating that the forces of tyranny could be challenged with truth and tenacity. For Richard, the bogus arrest attempt was a turning point. It was the moment that forced the hidden mechanics of Eleanor's extortion to the forefront, revealing that her tactics were not limited to mere paper shuffling, but escalated to physical intimidation and the misuse of law enforcement procedures. The exposure of the impostors, aided by Richard's decisive reveal of his true identity, opened a floodgate of public outrage and catalyzed further investigation into the HOA's operations. This event marked a critical juncture. It turned onlookers into active participants in the fight for justice. Neighbors who had once remained silent began to share their own stories of harassment, and the collective anger allowed Richard's team to gather substantial evidence that would later aid legal proceedings. The bogus warrant incident was not only a personal victory but also a symbolic moment for the entire Willow Creek community. A stark reminder that deception and abuse would no longer be tolerated. In the weeks that followed, the incident was discussed in every household, served as a rallying cry against Eleanor Voss's regime, and became a key piece of evidence as the legal authorities began to unravel her vast network of corruption. Richard Malone's bravery in exposing the false arrest attempt cemented his reputation not only as a defender of his own rights but as a guardian of justice for the community at large. After the shocking bogus arrest attempt, Richard Malone was more determined than ever to expose the corrupt underpinnings of Eleanor Voss's reign over Willow Creek. His journey to uncover the full extent of the fraud began with a deep dive into the administrative records and financial files that had long been kept hidden behind the polished veneer of the Homeowners Association. Richard began by collecting every document and notice that had been served to him and his neighbors. The pile of paperwork, filled with obscure citations and intimidating fines, hinted at an intricate and deliberate scheme designed not only to fill the coffers of the HOA but also to terrify property owners into compliance. Determined to leave no stone unturned, Richard enlisted the help of a trusted accountant from a neighboring town, whose expertise in forensic auditing revealed patterns that were impossible to ignore. In what he later described as a painstaking but necessary investigation, Richard discovered that the fines levied by Eleanor Voss's administration were not based on any verifiable violations. Instead, he found that these arbitrary fines were part of a broader extortion racket. Digging further, Richard uncovered evidence of kickbacks linked to local vendors, inflated charges on community services, and fraudulent billing practices that siphoned money from unsuspecting residents directly into Eleanor's personal accounts. Documents revealed that contracts for maintenance and repair jobs had been awarded to companies with clear ties to Eleanor's inner circle. The audit uncovered alarming discrepancies in the budget reports, sums of money that appeared and disappeared without a trace, and payments made for work that never actually took place. Richard realized he had stumbled on a highly organized network of corruption, one that exploited the trust and vulnerability of the community. As the evidence piled up, Richard decided to take action. He convened a small group of affected homeowners, presenting his findings in a series of confidential meetings held in the back room of a local community center. The revelations were met with shock and indignation. Many residents had no idea that they were being systematically overcharged and manipulated through fraudulent fines. What emerged from these meetings was a collective resolve to bring the operation into the light. Richard and his allies gathered testimonials from neighbors who had received inexplicable bills, copies of notices, and even security footage that documented the intimidating visits by Eleanor's agents. Together, they created a meticulously organized dossier that detailed every instance of financial malpractice and abuse of power. The assembly of such overwhelming evidence marked the turning point, enabling them to contact legal authorities and independent auditors. Local law enforcement, initially skeptical of the claims, soon became convinced by the thorough documentation provided by Richard. With support from the district attorney's office, a formal investigation into the HOA's activities was launched. Eleanor Voss's long-practiced secrecy was crumbling, the once imposing facade of control was yielding to the relentless scrutiny of justice. Throughout the investigation, Richard maintained a stoic presence amid rising tensions and occasional threats from those loyal to Eleanor. His unwavering determination not only fortified his own resolve but also galvanized the community. For many in Willow Creek, Richard had transformed from a lone victim into a beacon of transparency and accountability. In his quest to expose the fraud, he was not simply fighting for himself but for every resident who had been exploited and intimidated. The exposure of the fraud network had far-reaching implications. It illuminated how a single individual, wielding unchecked power, could orchestrate a vast web of deceit and extortion. The investigation's progress signaled a watershed moment for Willow Creek, as residents prepared to reclaim their community from the grips of corruption. With the evidence now in the hands of legal authorities, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation with Eleanor Voss and her cronies. As the investigation advanced, the legal consequences of Eleanor Voss's fraudulent actions became inevitable. With mounting evidence of extortion, financial malfeasance, and intimidation, Richard Malone found himself at the center of a legal storm that would reshape Willow Creek's future. The community, once paralyzed by fear, began to rally around him, insisting that justice be served. The court proceedings were set in motion quickly. Local prosecutors, bolstered by the extensive documentation Richard and the homeowner coalition had assembled, charged Eleanor with a series of criminal offenses. The charges ranged from fraud and extortion to impersonation and vandalism related to the intimidation campaign. The courtroom became the battleground where Richard's evidence was pitted against the elaborate facade of the HOA's authoritarian rule. During the trial, Richard's calm testimony stood in stark contrast to the frantic admissions of the HOA's enforcers. His detailed account of the myriad abuses, complete with photographs, financial records, and video evidence, left little doubt about the extent of Eleanor's corruption. One key moment was his presentation of the audio-visual recordings that documented shadowy figures vandalizing his property, an incontrovertible demonstration of the intimidation tactics that had plagued him and his neighbors. The prosecution built a compelling narrative, illustrating how Eleanor had exploited her position to create an environment of fear and submission. Eyewitnesses, emboldened by Richard's example, came forward to testify about their own experiences of harassment, unfair fines, and intrusive inspections. Their testimonies provided a human face to the extensive documentation and added emotional weight to the charges. In a dramatic climax to the trial, the jury deliberated for only a few days before returning a verdict that left the courtroom in stunned silence. Eleanor Voss was found guilty on multiple counts, her actions condemned as a gross abuse of power. The sentence, heavy and uncompromising, was designed to serve as a deterrent against any future attempts to manipulate community governance for personal gain. Richard Malone's role in the trial earned him widespread recognition. He was lauded not only for his bravery but also for his commitment to justice and community service. His actions had exposed a network of deceit that had reaped illicit profits at the expense of innocent homeowners. The verdict was celebrated as a victory for transparency and accountability, a clear repudiation of the tyranny that had once gripped Willow Creek. In the aftermath of the trial, the community did not immediately return to normalcy. The shock of the revelations and the severity of the sentence left many residents grappling with the scars of the prolonged period of intimidation. However, the conviction of Eleanor Voss laid the foundation for a new era in community governance. Legal reforms were swiftly proposed to ensure that no single individual could ever again consolidate so much power over an entire neighborhood. Richard continued to play an active role in the rebuilding process, working closely with the interim HOA board to draft policies that enshrined fairness, transparency, and accountability. The community meetings that once brimmed with fear and trepidation were replaced by open forums where every resident had a voice. Trust, once shattered, began to be pieced back together, slowly but surely, under the watchful eyes of local authorities and civic leaders. The legal reckoning had not only punished the wrongdoer but had sparked a broader conversation about governance, power, and community rights. It was a transformative moment in Willow Creek's history, proving that even the most deeply entrenched corruption could be uprooted when communities unite in the spirit of justice. In the months following the legal proceedings, Willow Creek experienced a renaissance, a transformation from an atmosphere of fear into one of hope and renewal. The conviction of Eleanor Voss was not merely a punitive measure, it marked the beginning of a community-wide healing process. Richard Malone, having borne the brunt of the corruption, emerged as a respected figure and a leader dedicated to restoring the neighborhood's trust and dignity. Under the guidance of Richard and the new interim HOA board, reform measures were rapidly implemented. New policies were enacted to ensure transparent financial practices and checks on administrative authority. The community, once subdued by intimidation, now embraced a spirit of democratic participation. Town hall meetings became a common sight, where every resident could voice concerns and offer solutions. The physical scars left by the vandalism and neglect were addressed through collective effort. Neighbors organized cleanup drives, repaired damaged public spaces, and even began tending to community gardens. Each act of rebuilding served as a symbol of their resilience. Proof that the damage inflicted by abuse of power could, with time and cooperation, be healed. Richard's personal journey was reflected in the broader transformation. No longer seen solely as a victim, he was now considered a champion of justice, an emblem of the community's fight against corruption. His actions had demonstrated that standing up for one's rights could lead to profound change, inspiring others to take action against injustice, no matter how daunting it might seem. Moreover, the saga of Willow Creek became a cautionary tale that extended beyond its borders. Local media covered the story extensively, and it sparked discussions in neighboring communities about the importance of transparent governance and citizen involvement in local affairs. The public acknowledgement of systemic abuse served as a powerful deterrent against similar practices elsewhere. As the community emerged from its long winter of oppression, celebrations of renewal grew. A large community festival was organized in the town center, symbolizing a fresh start and the re-establishment of trust between residents and local leadership. Speeches were made, and Richard was honored for his relentless pursuit of justice. In his address, he reminded everyone that vigilance and unity were the true cornerstones of a free and fair society. Willow Creek's journey from a place of shadowed fear to one of open collaboration became a beacon of hope, a message that even in the face of overwhelming abuse, justice and truth could prevail. Richard Malone's legacy, intertwined with the community's rebirth, was a testament to the enduring power of collective action. As the sun set on that hopeful day, a renewed sense of optimism pervaded every corner of Willow Creek, promising a future built on transparency, respect, and unity.